A routine traffic stop. A frustrated driver. A police officer convinced he is in control. But when he looks in the back seat, his world shifts in an instant. The quiet, suburban street seemed like the perfect picture of calm, trees lining the sidewalk, neatly manicured lawns stretching between pristine homes. The hum of distant traffic was barely audible over the chirping of birds, and the world appeared to be moving at its usual slow pace. A single red car, parked on the side of the road, stood out against the quiet backdrop. Its engine idled, the driver's knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His face was a mixture of frustration and confusion, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the rear window of the car. Standing beside the vehicle, Officer Richard Gaines looked down at the driver, his posture stiff and commanding. He was a man used to being in control, used to having the upper hand in any situation. His uniform, dark blue and crisp, matched his demeanor perfectly. Gaines had dealt with countless traffic stops, written up countless tickets, and handed out more warnings than he could count. He knew the drill. He knew what to expect. But this stop felt different. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way the driver, Daniel Carter, was gripping the wheel so tightly, his jaw clenched with visible frustration. Or maybe it was the subtle tension coming from the back seat, where a little girl sat, clutching a stuffed toy as though it were her only protection from the world outside. Olivia, the 8-year-old girl in the back seat, sat quietly. Her small hands gripped her soft toy with surprising strength, as if she were trying to hold on to some semblance of security. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, her gaze fixed firmly on the toy in her lap. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and although her expression remained still, anyone who was paying attention could see that she was nervous. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, but she sensed the unease in the air. Daniel's voice broke through the silence, his words sharp and demanding. "What's this about, officer? You pull me over for a routine stop, and now you're giving me this?" His voice carried the weight of frustration, of knowing that he wasn't going to be treated fairly, that the very system meant to protect him would judge him just like every other person who looked like him. Officer Gaines didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He had faced this type of challenge from drivers countless times. "It's just a routine stop, sir," Gaines said, his tone firm. "I'll need to see your license and registration, please." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he glanced over at Olivia in the back seat. She was still clutching her toy, her eyes fixed downward. Daniel let out a sharp breath and slowly reached for his glove compartment, his movements stiff and mechanical. His focus remained on the officer, every part of him tense. But just as Gaines was about to ask for more identification, he heard it. A small voice, barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the rising tension. "Are you going to hurt him?" The words froze everyone in place. The question didn't come from the adult man sitting in the front seat, but from Olivia, the little girl in the back. She didn't look up, her face still turned downward, but her voice carried an innocence mixed with fear. The toy in her hands seemed to become even tighter as she asked the question again, softer this time. "Are you going to hurt him?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Officer Gaines was paralyzed. His trained response was to focus on the driver, but the question had shaken him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A traffic stop wasn't supposed to provoke this kind of response. A child's voice, full of uncertainty, full of a terror that was clearly not her own, but was born from something far more sinister. Daniel's face hardened, "Olivia, honey, it's okay," he said softly, turning around to try to comfort her, but his eyes remained locked on the officer, his body tense and protective. He knew exactly what Olivia had heard. He had heard it too, countless times. The deep-seated fear in her voice wasn't just an innocent question. It was a reflection of everything she had been taught about the world. And it wasn't the kind of thing an 8-year-old should know. Officer Gaines stood there, momentarily caught off guard. The normal routine of the stop had slipped away, replaced by the raw reality of what had just been said. A chill ran down his spine. The officer was used to control, to maintaining power over situations, but now the control was slipping from his grasp. The tension between them was palpable. Gaines glanced back at Olivia, and then, without fully processing what had just happened, he forced himself back into his usual authoritative stance. "Everything is fine," he said, his voice steadier now, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just transpired in the span of a few words. "Just sit tight, both of you." But Olivia's voice remained in his ears. Her question had cracked something in the officer's usual rigid stance, and for a brief moment his gaze lingered on her, on the child who was so much more aware than she should have been. The realization that the world could do this to children, instill fear in them at such an early age, left him momentarily speechless. He didn't know it yet, but this stop was going to change everything for him. The simple, routine traffic stop that he had initiated would soon become something much bigger than any of them had anticipated. Officer Richard Gaines had always believed in the idea of law and order. It was what had drawn him to the police force in the first place, a sense of structure, of control, of keeping people in line. The idea of authority and maintaining peace in a community was something he took pride in, even if it meant occasionally stepping on toes. He had done countless traffic stops in the same neighborhoods, stopping drivers for what he believed were justifiable reasons: speeding, broken taillights, or failure to signal. But in his eyes, the issue always seemed to be with the drivers, and not the system itself. Gaines was no stranger to this part of town. It was a working-class area where the homes were modest, and the streets were lined with old oak trees and the occasional corner store. It was a place where people worked hard to get by, and where everyone seemed to mind their own business, or at least that's how Gaines saw it. To him, it was just another day on patrol, another routine stop that would go according to the book. But there was one glaring issue that Gaines never acknowledged: his disproportionate tendency to pull over Black and Latino drivers in this very area. He never asked himself why, but the pattern was undeniable. Whether he pulled someone over for speeding or for a broken brake light, he always seemed to find an excuse to stop people who didn't look like him. The uncomfortable truth was that Gaines never faced any consequences. He never questioned his actions or the very system that allowed him to be above reproach. In his mind, he was just doing his job. After all, his training, his instincts, everything about his career told him that his actions were justified. He was keeping the community safe, maintaining order, and holding people accountable. But today, something felt different. He had stopped countless drivers before, but today was different because it was Daniel Carter behind the wheel. Daniel Carter had lived in this neighborhood his entire life. The small house he had worked hard to pay for was where he had built his family and raised his daughter, Olivia. A man in his mid-30s, Daniel worked long hours at a local factory, doing back-breaking work for a paycheck that barely covered bills and groceries. He had learned the hard way how to navigate a world that didn't always have his back. especially when it came to authority. The streets were a battleground. The constant fear that one wrong move could escalate into something much worse had always been a part of his life. The routine was ingrained in him. Hands on the wheel, keep calm, avoid eye contact, and never escalate the situation. He had seen too many others get caught up in the system, and he knew better than to challenge it. It didn't matter if he was doing everything right. It never seemed to make a difference. He had had his fair share of encounters with the police, each one a reminder that there were certain things he just couldn't control. But today, as the police lights flashed in his rearview mirror, something was different. Maybe it was the way his daughter sat quietly in the back seat, her small hands gripping her stuffed toy, or the growing sense of frustration building inside him. For once, he couldn't stay silent. He had been stopped too many times for reasons that didn't make sense, and today, he wasn't going to let it slide. As the officer approached his window, Daniel's heart rate quickened. The familiar tension gripped his chest. Olivia, usually so carefree, sat motionless in the back seat. Her hands were trembling slightly, her toy pressed tightly against her chest. Daniel's eyes flicked to her in the rearview mirror. He saw the way she was fidgeting, how she was staring straight ahead, avoiding making eye contact. He saw it then, the subtle shift in her demeanor. She wasn't scared, not in the way that children are scared of things they can't understand. She was scared in the way a child gets scared when they sense that something is wrong with the world, when they can feel the tension in the air, but they don't fully know why. Olivia, at only 8 years old, didn't fully understand the complex web of racial profiling, systematic injustice, or why her father was always on edge when the police were around. But she had seen it in his eyes before. She had seen the way he stiffened every time the sirens went off, how his body went rigid when a police car passed by. She knew something was different today, something that made her hands tremble a little harder as she clutched her toy. But as Olivia shifted in her seat, trying to keep calm, she couldn't help the whisper that escaped her lips. "Are you going to hurt him?" The words hit Daniel like a freight train. He wasn't prepared for that, not from her. She wasn't just reacting to the situation. She was mirroring his own fear. He quickly tried to calm her down, reassuring her that everything would be fine. But he knew that the fear she felt wasn't just her own. It was a reflection of everything she had learned from the world around her. It was a direct consequence of the system Daniel had been forced to navigate his entire life. But no matter how many times Daniel had learned to follow the rules, no matter how much he knew about the world, today it wasn't enough. The anxiety in Olivia's voice, the grip she had on her stuffed toy, and the haunting realization that the system had already failed them once again settled heavily in his chest. He glanced at Officer Gaines, the same man who had stopped him countless times before. And today, that fear, those old habits of compliance, felt more suffocating than ever. The air between Officer Gaines and Daniel Carter was thick with tension. The officer's tone remained firm, almost mechanical as he barked, "License and registration." It wasn't a request. It was an order, one he'd given countless times before, to people who knew exactly what was expected of them. But this was different. The steady rhythm of Gaines' authority was punctured by the uncertainty that lurked beneath the surface. Daniel's heart pounded as he stared at the officer. He sighed, the frustration bubbling up inside him. He knew how this went. He knew what was coming, but today, he wasn't going to stay quiet. "I wasn't speeding," Daniel said, his voice barely containing the anger that was building. His hand moved cautiously toward the glove compartment, knowing full well how easily a small movement could be misinterpreted. So, what is this really about? Gaines didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed, unblinking, on Daniel as he continued to stand at the driver's side window. The silence between them felt suffocating, charged with a simmering unease that Daniel couldn't ignore. The officer's gaze never wavered, yet there was something about it, something cold, that sent a chill crawling up Daniel's spine. Then, from the back seat, a small, trembling voice broke the silence. "He is trying to hurt me." The words struck like a thunderclap. Olivia's voice, so soft yet laced with fear, reached both of them, piercing through the thick layer of tension. Gaines froze. His body stiffened as his gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where Olivia sat clutching her stuffed toy tighter than ever. Her wide eyes, filled with terror, stared out the window, unable to meet the officer's gaze. The world seemed to slow. The air, already thick with tension, turned frigid, as though a wave of coldness swept through the car. Olivia's words echoed in Gaines' mind, repeating over and over as his grip on the radio tightened. Why would she say that? What could she possibly know? His hand twitched, a silent response to the panic rising in his chest. He had been trained to handle a variety of situations, but this was different. He had been a police officer for years, dealt with criminals, suspects, and situations far more dangerous than this. But this moment, this was something he wasn't prepared for. A child's innocent words had struck him like a blow to the gut. His mind raced, trying to piece together what Olivia had said. She couldn't know anything about him, could she? She couldn't have any idea of what he had done, of how many times he had pulled over drivers who looked like her father, of how many times he had questioned people just because of the color of their skin. But then, why did she say those words? Why did she look so scared? For the first time in a long time, doubt crept into Officer Gaines's mind. His strong, unshakable stance faltered, and for the briefest moment, he wasn't sure what to do next. Olivia's teary eyes locked with his in the mirror for the briefest moment. Her gaze was pleading, filled with an understanding that was far beyond her years. And in that moment, something inside Gaines shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but he felt it. The foundation of his certainty, the walls he had built around himself as an officer of the law, suddenly seemed fragile. He stepped back from the car, still shaken, his mind grappling with the words Olivia had spoken. He looked over at Daniel, who was staring back at him with equal parts defiance and fear. "Is this how it goes, huh?" Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with years of frustration. "I follow the rules, and you still come for me. For my daughter. She's scared, officer. She shouldn't be scared, but you made her feel that way." Gaines's jaw tightened as he clenched his hands into fists. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the words of an innocent child to make him question everything. His eyes flicked back to Olivia, her hands still tightly clutching the toy. She wasn't just scared of the situation. She was scared because she knew. She knew, deep down, what this world had conditioned her to feel, what it had taught her about people who looked like her father. Her words were a mirror, reflecting the reality of a world that had failed both of them. "Everything all right, officer?" A voice from the radio crackled, snapping Gaines out of his daze. But the question didn't come from the dispatcher. It came from the back seat, where Daniel's voice had suddenly taken on a darker edge. He wasn't just looking for an answer anymore. He was waiting for an explanation. And for the first time in a long time, Officer Gaines found himself at a loss for words. The camera focused on Olivia's wide, teary eyes as she continued to clutch her stuffed toy. Her small frame, vulnerable and exposed, seemed to highlight the deep-seated fear she had learned to carry with her at such a young age. It was a fear that was all too familiar, one that had shaped the lives of so many others like her. The camera zoomed in closer, capturing every tremor in her hands, every flicker of doubt that had crossed Gaines's mind. The world seemed to hold its breath. "Where are you watching from?" "And what time is it?" the narrator's voice asked. "Imagine being in this car right now. What would you do?" The question hung in the air, just like the tense silence that followed Olivia's words. Officer Gaines stood frozen for just a moment longer, his heart racing as his training collided with the harsh reality that had just unfolded before him. The stillness was suffocating, and for the first time in his career, Gaines wasn't sure how this situation would end. The moment Officer Gaines stepped back from the car, his world was already shifting. He had always prided himself on control, but now doubt clouded his thoughts, swirling around Olivia's words. Her terrified gaze, those simple yet powerful words, "He is trying to hurt me," had shattered something inside him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure who the real threat was. Gaines stood there, frozen, as the tension in the air thickened. The sound of Olivia's voice still echoed in his mind. How had he missed it? The fear that had been evident in her eyes, in the trembling of her hands, should have been a warning, but it had only made him more rigid, more defensive. His hand hovered near his radio as a deep sense of dread settled over him. Just as he was about to speak again, the voice from his radio broke through the silence. "Dispatch. That red car matches an Amber Alert report. The girl in the backseat. She was kidnapped an hour ago." Gaines's blood ran cold. The world around him seemed to shift into slow motion. His heart skipped a beat as he processed the words. Kidnapped. His gaze darted back to the rearview mirror, to Olivia, her wide eyes, her shaking hands. The weight of the revelation slammed into him. He blinked, his mind scrambling to make sense of it all. The moment of realization came crashing down on him. He had been so focused on Daniel, so convinced that the situation was just another routine stop, that he had completely missed the bigger picture. The truth had been right in front of him, but he hadn't been paying attention. He hadn't been listening. The AMBER alert. Olivia. She had been taken. And Gaines had just been standing there, letting time slip away as the true danger sat just behind him. He turned to Daniel, his words catching in his throat. You weren't angry with me, were you?" Gaines's voice faltered as the weight of it all settled in. "You were scared. You weren't just frustrated with the stop. You were terrified of being caught. And Olivia, she was trying to tell me. She was trying to help me understand." Daniel's eyes locked with Gaines, a mixture of anger and desperation flooding his gaze. The realization hit him too. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. His daughter wasn't just a child trying to get through a difficult situation. She was signaling for help, and Gaines hadn't seen it. He had missed it. "She was scared," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "She's been through hell already, and now you're stopping us, thinking she's the one who's at fault." Gaines swallowed hard, the words stinging as they echoed in his mind. He turned back to Olivia, who was now gazing at him with wide, trusting eyes. His stomach turned as the weight of her fear pressed on him like a suffocating fog. He had almost let her go. He had almost let this child slip back into the hands of the very man who had taken her. And that realization was the hardest pill to swallow. I almost let her go, Gaines muttered to himself. His eyes grew wide as the enormity of his failure settled in. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Everything, his training, his pride, the uniform he wore, had become irrelevant in the face of this shocking truth. The real danger hadn't been standing in front of him. It had been in the back seat all along. The twisted irony of the situation hit him hard. He had been so focused on protocol, on maintaining control, that he had missed the one thing that truly mattered: Olivia's safety. Daniel, still in the driver's seat, clenched his jaw. "My daughter. She's been through enough," he said, his voice steady but tinged with raw emotion. "And you're the one who almost made it worse." Gaines didn't respond. He couldn't. There were no words that could undo the panic he had caused, no excuse that could justify his failure to see what was so clearly right in front of him. All he could do was stand there, feeling every ounce of his confidence and authority crumble into nothing. The realization settled in deeper. This was not just a traffic stop. This was not about a small mistake or a misunderstanding. This was about saving a life. It had been his responsibility, and for a moment he had failed. "Olivia," Gaines whispered, his voice finally softening, "I am so sorry." His eyes met hers through the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he saw the relief flicker in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a small sign that he might still be able to make it right. "She's not just a victim anymore," Daniel added, glancing at his daughter through the rearview mirror. "She's a survivor." For the first time, Gaines realized just how true that was. The tension, the fear, and the helplessness in Olivia's eyes, he would never forget it. But this moment had to be the turning point. There was no going back, but there was still a chance to do something right. As his hand hovered over his radio, ready to call in the backup that they now desperately needed, Officer Gaines understood one thing for certain. Olivia's voice would no longer be ignored. The real story unfolded before Officer Gaines's eyes faster than he could process. The voice on the radio confirmed his worst fear. The Amber Alert had been real, and Daniel was not Olivia's father. A chill ran down Gaines's spine as the officer on the other end of the radio reported a bystander had called 911 moments earlier. They had spotted a little girl who seemed off in the back seat of a car, making her seem distressed, isolated, and clearly uncomfortable. That little girl was Olivia, the same girl he had just nearly let slip away. Daniel Carter had taken Olivia, pretending to be her father. The realization hit Gaines like a ton of bricks. He had missed the signals, failed to question the situation, and allowed himself to be lulled into a false sense of control. His instincts had betrayed him, and in doing so, he had allowed a child to remain in danger. Without hesitation, Gaines yanked open the driver's side door, his body moving faster than his mind could catch up. He grabbed Daniel by the arm and pulled him forcefully from the car. The movement was swift, fueled by his overwhelming need to correct the mistake he had made. Daniel struggled against him, his face twisting in anger as he gritted his teeth. "Let go of me," he yelled, but Gaines didn't relent. The man was dangerous, and now, with the truth revealed, there was no more time for hesitation. Olivia, who had been sitting quietly in the back seat, staring at the scene unfolding around her, suddenly burst into tears. The relief, the overwhelming weight of knowing she was finally safe, sent her into a fit of sobs. Her small body trembled as she cried, the tears flowing freely down her cheeks as she reached for the stuffed toy that had been her only source of comfort. "Olivia," Gaines murmured, turning toward her. He watched her in shock as the tears rolled down her face, the little girl finally realizing she had been saved. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His stomach churned as he realized how close they had come to losing her. The real weight of the situation crashed over Gaines. He had nearly let her disappear, had nearly allowed a predator to slip through his fingers. He had been too quick to judge, too slow to react. His thoughts were spinning, and the shame was overwhelming. But there was no more time for regret. He had to act now, and thankfully, he still had the chance to make things right. Backup arrived quickly, more officers flooding the scene as they took control of the situation. Gaines didn't take his eyes off Daniel, who was now being cuffed. Daniel's face twisted into a cruel sneer as he looked up at the officer. His words were sharp, filled with disdain and venom. "You almost let me go," Daniel spat, his eyes burning with hatred. "You almost failed her. You almost let her go back to me." Gaines flinched at the words, the reality of what had almost happened hitting him harder than any punch. He had failed Olivia. He had failed to see through the facade, failed to recognize the threat before it was too late. The doubt that had crept in earlier had been justified, and now the consequences were inescapable. But there was no going back. The arrest was made, and Daniel was shoved into the back of a patrol car. Olivia, still crying, but now feeling the first stirrings of relief, was gently led away by one of the officers. They would take her to safety, back to the people who cared for her, back to a life she had once known, a life she could reclaim. Gaines stood frozen for a moment, his hands still gripping the door, his chest tight with the weight of the entire experience. His mind raced. "I almost let her disappear." The words kept repeating, echoing in his mind, the sting of his failure fresh and painful. As the car carrying Daniel pulled away, Gaines allowed himself a moment of deep, painful reflection. It was a small comfort that he had been able to stop Daniel before it was too late, but the damage had been done. He would never forget Olivia's tear-streaked face, nor would he ever forget how close he had come to making the wrong decision. "Olivia's safe," he whispered under his breath, the words feeling hollow even as they left his mouth. He had saved her today, but at what cost? The sound of Olivia's cries, muffled now by the distance, was all that remained as the scene began to settle. The aftermath of the chaos that had unfolded would linger, but at least for today, the right thing had been done. Daniel Carter would answer for his crimes, and Olivia would finally have the chance to be free. Gaines stood tall, his resolve hardening. He had made mistakes, but he would learn from them. The lesson, harsh as it was, had been learned. The aftermath of the situation settled around Officer Gaines like an oppressive weight. His training had told him to rely on instincts, to follow procedure, to maintain control, but today those instincts had failed him. He had thought he was dealing with just another routine traffic stop, a simple citation. He had believed the problem was right in front of him, in the driver's seat. But the real danger had been hidden in the backseat, and it had almost slipped away. As he stood there, watching the scene unfold in front of him, Gaines couldn't help but reflect on the events. He had always prided himself on his ability to judge a situation accurately, on his quick thinking and resolve. But today, his bias had clouded his judgment. He had been so ready to accuse, to assume that this was just another problem to deal with, that he hadn't stopped to think critically, to listen. His quick assumption had nearly cost a little girl her life. It wasn't until Olivia spoke that Gaines realized how close he had come to letting a criminal escape. He hadn't questioned enough. He hadn't been open to the truth. His preconceived notions about the situation had nearly led him to make a tragic mistake. And as he stood there, watching the officers secure Daniel and Olivia's family rush to her side, the sting of his own failure hit him harder than any reprimand ever could. Olivia's mother appeared at the scene, her face flushed with desperation and relief. She rushed to her daughter, dropping to her knees and pulling Olivia into her arms. The sight of a mother reunited with her child, after what must have been a terrifying ordeal, was enough to make anyone's heart ache. But for Gaines, it was a sharp reminder of how close he had come to making the wrong decision. Her arms wrapped around Olivia, holding her tightly, and Olivia's small body trembled in her mother's embrace. The stuffed toy, still clutched in Olivia's hand, was the only thing she had carried through the entire ordeal. But now, it seemed to symbolize the safety she had longed for, the comfort that had eluded her for far too long. Gaines stood still, watching the reunion. His uniform felt heavier than it ever had before, a symbol of authority that had, in this moment, failed to protect the innocent. His hands rested on his hips, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Olivia was safe now, but he could not forget how close he had come to failing her. The bitter taste of his mistake lingered. He hadn't realized it in the moment, but Olivia's plea for help had been a cry for something far beyond the situation he had assumed was unfolding. He had seen it as a routine stop, but to Olivia, it was a plea for salvation, a desperate cry for someone, anyone, to listen. His failure to understand that until the last minute was something he would carry with him. The sound of Olivia's laughter, tentative but genuine, broke through his thoughts as she held on to her mother. It was a sound that marked the end of her nightmare, one that Gaines had almost let continue. The weight of that nearly broke him. The lesson was harsh, but necessary. "What time is it where you are?" the voice on the screen asked, cutting through the tension that still hung in the air. If you were in Officer Gaines's shoes, would you have realized the truth in time? Gaines didn't have an answer. His mind kept replaying those moments, Olivia's terrified eyes, her quiet plea for help. How much longer would it have taken him to recognize the truth if not for her? Would he have known in time to save her? That question would haunt him for a long time to come. In the final shot, Gaines remained frozen in place, still standing by his car, watching as Olivia was comforted by her mother. There were no words. There didn't need to be. The look on his face said it all, the realization of how close he had come to letting this child slip through his fingers, of how his actions, or lack thereof, had nearly taken her from her family. Daniel, now handcuffed, stood off to the side, a smirk playing on his lips, as though he knew how close he had come to getting away with his crime. It made Gaines's blood run cold. But the officers were here now. The truth had been revealed, and Olivia was finally safe. The hardest lesson, however, was the one Gaines would take with him, a reminder that judgment must always be earned, not assumed. And he would never forget the day he almost failed to save a life.